Alrighty, welcome everyone. It is 10 o'clock, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have a few stragglers coming in, but I will get my introductions out of the way. So this is our second session for Day of Dialogue today, and we have more events and more to talk about than time of the day. So we are doubling up on events. And in case you missed it, you are in the session on impacts of the 2016 election on politics and the LGBTQ plus community. My name is Callie Wynn. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the graduate assistant for on-campus events and civic literacy at the Center for Civic Engagement. A little bit about CCE. Our mission is to encourage students to take an active role in their communities and to foster broader national and international dialogues. We do that by putting on events like these and others, which allow for discussion, and also by encouraging our undergraduate fellows to work closely with some local organizations in Nassau County. If you are an undergraduate student at Hofstra with whom these ideas resonate, please consider applying to CCE. We'll have several fellowship positions opening next semester. Now, to thank some folks who worked hard on this event, it would not have been possible without the support of the Provost's Office and of University Relations. And additionally, we are indebted to the Executive Director of the Hofstra Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins, for all the work she's invested in today's events. We are also thankful for the Center's Director, Phil Dalton. I would also like to recognize CCE's fellows who have been instrumental in conceiving events and helping market all of them and administering them. We could not have held this event without any of these people I've mentioned. Finally, I will ask you to note a link I'm about to post in the chat. This link will take you to other events of the day. There are several more running all the way till 7:30 tonight. After this session, please take a look at that link and join us for more dialogue. Now, I will hand this off to today's moderator, Associate Professor of Counseling and Mental Health Professions, Alicia Bosley. Professor.
Thank you so much, Callie. As mentioned, my name is Alicia Bosley. I am the director of the Couple and Family Therapy Program, and I also am a faculty member and a faculty mentor in the LGBT Studies minor program here at Hofstra. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I also wanted to acknowledge Dr. Andrea Nerlish, who is assisting and has been instrumental in giving feedback and also assisting with this event. This session was inspired by our passion for social justice to not only draw attention to the inequities that exist in our society, but also to take steps to do something about them. Ever since the 2016 presidential race and election, many minority groups have faced increased uncertainty, discrimination, and harassment in their own neighborhoods and communities. And of course, this includes many minority groups such as Muslims, immigrants, Black Americans, but the LGBTQ plus community has been uniquely targeted in this strange new socio-political climate. In the sense that newly won rights, such as the ability to serve openly in the military and access to marriage equality, have been threatened, debated on kind of this national stage, and in many cases taken away only a few years after they were granted. So it's important to consider that these rights, among others, are offered unquestioningly to all other US citizens. So there's a lot of disparity still existing that's really been brought into question since the previous presidential election. It is important, of course, also to acknowledge that one person or administration or political group is not responsible for larger social trends. Rather, it's that politics and social views and patterns tend to systemically influence one another, almost like a chicken and egg scenario where each one can impact the other and then expand on the, movements and decisions of the other. So developing a better understanding of the impact of politics and political decisions on a specific group of human beings is really essential to understanding what we need to do to create social change, and particularly as we approach another major election in our country. So we have some excellent panelists with us today who are at the forefront of these efforts. And I'd like to briefly ask them to introduce themselves as I introduce them to you. So first we have Julie Gray Owens, who is the board chair and executive director of Gender Equality New York. Julie?
Good morning, everyone. I have been a transgender community advocate now for over 17 years, doing work in the legislative area as well as organizing our community across New York State. Our organization, Gender Equality New York, specifically advocates for transgender, non-binary, and the intersex community here in New York. And thrilled to be here and looking forward to a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. And next up, we have Dr. Joshua Hernandez, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and the director and owner of Mindful Changes Therapy in Wilton Manors, Florida. Dr. Hernandez.
Morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Dr. Hernandez, but you can all call me Josh. That's completely fine. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. And as Alicia said, I am the co-founder and director of Mindful Changes. But I don't only have a private practice, I also work in hospice. So I do a lot with people who are going through grief, who have a lot of anxiety within their lives, and who need someone to relieve some of that tension that they're going through. During my time in hospice, what I tend to do, I tend to use a lot of experiential mindfulness techniques, but I also tend to train them in LGBT related matters, because guess what? We get a lot of patients who happens to be trans couples or same-sex couples. So a lot of times, a lot of the doctors and a lot of the nurses don't really know, the basics of our community. So I have to train them in the most basics I can. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you, Josh. And now we have Aiden Kaplan, who is a licensed clinical social worker and the LGBTQ services manager at Pride for Youth with the Long Island Crisis Center. Aiden?
Excellent. Thank you so much. So my name is Aiden Kaplan. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I am the LGBTQ services manager at PFY, which basically means that I oversee all of our health and human services programs. I oversee the New York State HIV hotline. I oversee our regional prevention services grants. So I do a lot of work in both the prevention field, specifically around HIV, syphilis, and STIs, but also in health and human services and counseling for LGBTQ people on Long Island. In my personal life, one of my most recent work is I'm working with the National Association for Social Workers to create a mandatory LGBTQ education for social workers nationally. I am appalled that we don't have this yet. It's not required in a single school in the United States, and we need to change that. I do want to state before I pass it on that I am here representing a nonprofit, which means unfortunately I need to remain nonpartisan, as we've talked about already, but I can absolutely speak critically on policy. I just can't speak critically on officials or on specific political offices. So thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Completely understood. Thank you, Aiden. And last but not least, we have Chris Larocca, and I apologize if I just mispronounced your last name, who is a licensed mental health counselor and the founder and owner of Live Your Truth Counseling in New York City. Chris?
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here. Thank you. And yes, before I started my private practice, Live Your Truth Counseling, I worked for many years for the nonprofit in Manhattan called the Institute for Human Identity, also known as IHI. I still work for them in the capacity of, I am the director of professional development there, and have recently revamped and redeveloped their LGBTQ plus competency training program. So we do offer live trainings when it's not COVID times. And right now we do have a virtual online training as well. So it's actually 4 hours long, and we do offer CEU, continuing education credits for social workers and mental health counselors. If anybody's interested in that, you can find it through ihitherapy.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to all of you. Like I said, I'm really excited to have the four of you here today. I think your collective experience and expertise is really going to create a fabulous conversation today. So Before we get going with the questions, I just wanted to give a little bit of brief background for people who are a little bit newer to this topic. Basically, in February 2017, immediately after the last presidential election, the current administration officially revoked an Obama-era protection for transgender students in federally funded public schools. Now, this left trans students who already face disproportionate levels of bullying and discrimination in schools without protections to use bathrooms and locker rooms that align with their gender. And it also left their families without support to protect their children against these policies. That following July, the administration also announced that they would be banning trans people from serving in the military. This is important because it also denies openly transgender veterans the benefits that they have earned along with every other veteran from their previous service. Then in May 2018, the administration ruled that prisons should house inmates according to their gender assigned at birth, which potentially places incarcerated trans individuals at significant risk for harassment and violence. I don't think I need to go much into the risks inherent with incarceration, but if you can imagine being, someone who maybe doesn't outwardly conform to all these societal expectations we have of gender, you can imagine how much more dangerous and crucial that this becomes. Then this year, the administration rolled back healthcare protections for LGBTQ plus individuals, which allows healthcare professionals to refuse service, to those they perceive, keyword perceive, as being gay or transgender. This also allows hospitals to require patients to stop taking gender-affirming hormones as a condition of being treated there. It permits health insurance providers to refuse coverage for gender-affirming surgery or hormone replacement therapy. And this ruling also removed safe and protected access to medical care to thousands of Americans during a pandemic. Then in July, the administration moved to rule for shelters to house homeless trans people according to their sex assigned at birth rather than by their gender identity. These changes, again, are not limited to current political administrations. In 2016, FBI data indicated a sharp spike in hate crimes against LGBTQ plus Americans, and this has continued to increase slowly but steadily. So between 2014 and 2016, a nationwide poll of US citizens showed actually increasing comfort with and support of sexual minorities. So people who identify as lesbian or gay, as bisexual, as trans, or along the gender continuum and that trans umbrella. But in 2017, this momentum showing support and comfort stopped and actually began to reverse direction, with more Americans reporting discomfort with LGBTQ plus people or disapproval with them in certain scenarios. It's important because this reversal occurred at the same time as an increase in LGBTQ plus people reporting experiences of discrimination and harassment because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Most tragically, at least 31 trans Americans have been fatally shot or killed by other violent means since the beginning of 2020. And the majority of these have been Black and Latinx trans women. It's important to note that 31 is likely well below the actual number due to anti-transgender norms and lack of understanding. Many of these crimes are inaccurately reported in regards to the gender of the person who has been murdered. The Human Rights Campaign writes that this is the highest number of trans murders since they began tracking the number in 2013. So there are definitely some troubling social trends that have happened around and following the 2016 election cycle. it's important also to note that there are positive trends too. Social media campaigns and social science have really expanded awareness of the natural variation of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that has begun to normalize different identities and orientations in national discourse. Inclusion of pronouns in things like email signatures and on Zoom are becoming increasingly common. LGBTQ themed movies and TV shows are becoming staples on major channel lineups and streaming services. And most recently, this fall, gay Twitter reclaimed the hashtag Proud Boys from a national hate group with widespread support and celebration. So increasingly, LGBTQ plus Americans are being heard, seen, and respected. Another major win occurred in June 2020 when the Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act does protect LGBTQ plus Americans from discrimination based on sex. So this advanced some Obama era protections and further solidified the LGBTQ plus community's place among all other citizens. So it's important to note that, there has been, progress made along with some of the increased discrimination and risks. But it's also important to note that among all of these events, the national conversation around it has been very heated and pretty bitterly divided. And LGBTQ plus people have been forced to live in a culture that views their humanity, their rights, and their equality with fellow citizens as if it's something that's up for debate. And often these decisions are made by individuals or groups who don't identify as LGBTQ plus, and therefore can't really understand the true implications. So for LGBTQ plus Americans in 2020, and especially as we're approaching next week's election, politics are very, very personal. But enough from me. I would rather hand this over to the wisdom and insight of our panelists. So my first question to you all is, the past 4 years have been tumultuous ones for the LGBTQ plus community, and activism remains essential. In your experience, what are the current focuses of the LGBTQ plus group or groups in which you live and or work? Aiden, why don't we start with you?
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome, perfect. So I'm gonna probably take this in a direction that is a little bit different than how the question was meant to be addressed, but I am so glad that we received these questions in advance, because I was able to take some of these questions and go back to the community and actually talk with them about what they felt the answers were. So I did have a conversation this week. I never like to speak on behalf of the community without my clients having a voice. And something that I thought was so interesting out of what they were sharing with me when I was having this conversation was that right now, especially for LGBTQ youth on Long Island, the ones that are coming in for our services, their biggest concern is whether or not PFY will be there tomorrow. And I thought that that was something that I wasn't expecting. I expected other things to come up. And their main reason for that is that the way that the world looks right now during COVID is we can't even focus on the last 3 years of what's been going on politically, because for a lot of our clients, what is happening during COVID means that they don't have access to services, they don't have access to the programs that save lives and that they need to meet their needs. So I started to really think about this before coming in. And there was a study that was done about 2 months ago, and it was research done that gathered information from 72 LGBTQ services organizations across New York State. And what it found was that during COVID, because of the fact that the federal government is not providing relief aid to New York State right now, the LGBTQ services organizations that exist in New York State, more than half of them had to lay off staff, and 75% of them closed at least one program. I think that this is an important perspective to bring up, because I am finding as an advocate a difficulty fighting for equality right now when I can't provide the life-saving services that my clients need. And in some cases, those are things like I have clients dealing with housing insecurity and food insecurity. Their basic needs are not met. And as an agency, we can't afford to meet those needs because our state is not receiving the funding that it needs from the federal government. So I found difficulty processing this question a little bit coming in today, because I can't even focus on a lot of the rights issues that matter so much to this population, because our clients are not able to access the services they need.
Thank you, Aiden. It almost makes me think of, I'm assuming you're familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can't even worry about what the next steps are politically if you can't guarantee that basic services are, and not to discredit this amazing array of services you all offer, but when those aren't even guaranteed. Yeah, thank you. So Julie, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that, well, first of all, I really appreciate the question, because I think it gives us a little bit of a flavor for what's been happening for the past 4 years. Our organization, first of all, specifically focuses on New York State, but politically and legislatively, our focus is also all of New York State, only because of the fact that we know that whatever we might do on a federal level is going to be very, very limited as far as getting any kind of assistance and support. However, there's a lot that we can do in New York State. One of the biggest issues for our community, specifically the transgender, non-binary, and intersex community, is, first of all, we're small. So we're a very small number of people overall in New York State when you compare different groups. But the other side of it is that New York State is a huge state. And so what you have is a real problem in organizing, empowering, communicating, and trying to be aware of what are the needs for New Yorkers across the state. For example, you go to Buffalo, Buffalo's needs and situations are completely different than, for example, Albany, even though they're both, major cities. And obviously between those two cities, there's a whole lot of land and a whole lot of different topography and societies, for that matter, whether it's the Finger Lake area or whether it's the North Country, for example, up by Plattsburgh. So we've spent a good portion of our last 3 years traveling across the state. Now that's obviously been cut down. But our focus has been, first of all, in educating and doing outreach to the general public. Right now, what happens is that because of the situation, many of our community members are afraid to come out and be out and available. So what happens is the general public never learns about our lived experiences and some of the issues that we face. So what happens is because of that, we are still discriminated against and harassed, which pushes more of our members underground further, never coming out. So we have been focusing on trying to make sure that the general public has a better idea of our community through what we were doing was forums across the state. We would co-sponsor with churches and other groups and actually do like a gender 101 and also have panelists from our community just talk about their lived experiences. And it's always been very positive. So we just kicked over to virtual. And for us, what's interesting is I thought our first virtual one was going to be sort of a trial run and maybe we'd get 15 or 20 people. We actually over-registered, so we had to lock out. We're at, I guess our registrations, we allowed for 90. So we hit 90 in 3 days, which we're pretty impressed with. So we're going to continue those. The other thing that we have to do is because of the fact that most people aren't really very involved in the legislative advocacy work that needs to be done. We've been spending a lot of time prior to COVID up in Albany and, knocking on doors and talking to staff. And so we've been focusing on a certain number of bills that we have already passed, and there's a few that we're working on, and I'm sure we can talk about that somewhere along the line in this morning's event. And the final last two things are trying to connect our communities across New York State. So we've been acting as sort of a state collection, if you will, of trying to make sure that we get email addresses and links to other people, which also helps do our events that we're doing across the state as well. So that helps. And obviously empowering our community, getting people to feel more comfortable of speaking out, telling their stories and so forth are really important. And that's the way that we educate the general public. So making sure that community members feel supported and actually go through a certain degree of training. All our panelists, I vet all our panelists, and as they do it, they get more and more involved and they become more politically involved. So you know, we continue to grow the community and activate them, if you will.
Sounds like very important and rewarding work as well that you're doing. Like you said, I think, you know, providing that platform and that space seems essential more than ever.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you. So Chris, what about you?
Sure. I love that approach, Julie, about like getting into the community, having real direct contact with people. I think that's really where it's at, the impacting people emotionally and experientially. As we see, the research shows that homophobia and queerphobia is higher in areas where there are less queer people or less queer people that are out. And just having one relationship in your life, one positive interaction with a queer person can greatly influence how homophobic they are or how accepting, even embracing they are. Maybe more on that later, but to return to your question, I work with queer people every day. My practice specializes as a mental health counselor. I'm doing sometimes 5 sessions, 8 sessions a day. Morale is just way down. I'm sure you've all seen this since leading up to the 2016 election to now. There was this great sense of dread before and this kind of heaviness in the air every day. I see so many of my clients have just been in survival mode, referring to some of what Aiden talked about, just trying to meet their basic needs day to day and just wanting these times to kind of move on and be over because of the certain progresses and rights that we had before. A lot of liberations through the Obama administration, and then to have those rescinded, to have all queer literature taken off of the White House website the day that, or the week that the Trump administration took office. Ouch, like it just created this kind of like whiplash effect for queer people. It's almost a different kind of trauma, to a re-traumatization, to have the rights, to get close, and then to have them be taken away again. I've witnessed this to be a really unique experience that has led to even more lack of trust in government than queer people already had, even more of a major lacking sense of safety than queer people already had, just completely exacerbated by this time. And I think it's also made us more cynical about the progress that we make. I think this is pretty typical of history, that we take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. So I understand that can be how it works, but it still hurts. A friend of mine texted me yesterday just saying, like, do you think that now that Amy Barrett is on the Supreme Court, that like gay marriage could be reversed? She's like, should I go marry my partner right now? Because I mean, is that even gonna still be valid, even if it is reversed, anybody who is married? So it's all these things that takes up this psychic like headspace for queer people every day that I think most cis, and depending on their minority status, but most cis straight people don't have to worry about.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a lot of just extra concerns and, you know, factual information, as well as potential that, you know, LGBTQ plus people have to carry around them that wouldn't even occur to most of, you know, the, like you said, the cishet community in the United States. Thank you. And Josh.
Hi. So, I mean, I completely agree with what each and every person is saying. Chris, you did say, you know, about your friend asking if they should get married at the moment or not. And I think that's a very logical question to ask. I had a couple of clients in my own private practice that would state something similar because of all the things that have been happening within, you know, all the policies that are coming out and everything that they're seeing and all these new people coming into office or coming at all these things happening. And it kind of makes them feel a bit like they're unsafe. I think that's a good way to say it, because there's no protection as much as there used to be. And even though we're taking a few steps forward, it still feels like we're going backwards. And that's what makes it difficult in this whole entire situation. I think the fact that we're in a state of uncertainty is kind of difficult. And being in that state of uncertainty, we can't really predict what's going to happen. And that's what makes it really hard. With COVID, with race issues, with LGBT, there's so much things going on right now that makes it even tough. And it just impacts each and every factor from that social political level. And I can speak from my experience working in hospice, how difficult that has been too. You know, there's been some patients, especially within the LGBT community, who have been unable to visit their spouses or visit their loved one. And that has been so hard for them. I mean, I worked in the COVID units at the hospital where I worked in, and you know, these people can't talk or anything, and it makes it really hard for them to even see if their loved one is okay. And that's really hard enough. And I have to be the one that sits there and processes this information for them. A lot of my clients also bring up to me the hate crimes, and that has been really hard for them. I don't know if any of you have heard about some gay bashing in Miami Beach that has happened, but that has taken place. And a lot of my clients have been hyper vigilant as to, you know, what can they say in public? What should they say at their jobs? How should they act? Should they even hold hands? Are they allowed to kiss? All these things start to come to mind. And it gets really difficult for them to actually, you know, be themselves. And I can even speak truth to this, because even with my partner, when I go out with him, sometimes I don't even know if I should be able to hold his hands, because I don't know what's going to happen. And I do live in a queer inclusive environment, and there's, you know, it's a community that is all embracive, but we don't really know that when there's so many other voices in the back of our heads that are saying other different things. And I can also speak about my sisters, because my sisters, both of them are actually trans. So, you know, one of my sisters had to hide who she is multiple times, and that's been really difficult for her. And I had to be there for her and advocate for her during these times, because someone came out and said what they said about her, and she automatically got fired. So that's been a huge problem, especially with this whole religious freedom, or religious liberty, I think is what they call it. So it's been a roller coaster these past 4 years. It really has.
Yeah, it's a lot of ups and downs. And I think that several of you touched on is this, you know, kind of back and forth sense is extremely unsettling. It's, you know, if you don't know if a right granted is going to continue to be there, it creates a very, very uncertain, unsettling experience, both psychologically and just practically speaking. So I think some of what you all mentioned definitely speaks to that. So my second question is that many Americans believe that because of recent Supreme Court rulings in favor, for example, of marriage equality, or including LGBTQ plus people in the Civil Rights Act and those protections, LGBTQ plus people have fully equal rights in comparison to cisgender heterosexual peers. Of course, you know, this is hardly true. And so my question is what you see as the most important areas of disparity for LGBTQ plus groups in 2020. Chris, let's start with you.
Okay, sure. I've heard of some people making similar arguments regarding Black Lives Matter movement, and thinking racism ended when Black people got the right to vote, or when the end of Jim Crow laws. Very different flavor of discrimination, but it did make me think of that. Just as racism is systemic, we have to understand that so are heterosexism and cis-sexism, meaning that the kind of inherent assumption within society is that straight people are superior, and that cis non-trans people are superior. And I think it can be really, I mean, it's a very, very strong forces, but it can be subtle at times. And these forces do infiltrate every nook and cranny of society. So for any person with one or more minority identity, having the laws and rights to protect you matter a lot. And they are part of this systemic force at large. However, I think the laws alone are not enough to make people feel safe. Even good laws don't cancel out people's ignorance. I think it helps. I think, as we can see with the current administration, it has emboldened people with similar kind of hatred and ignorance to lash out. That's why part of why we're seeing the higher levels of the higher prevalence of violence. But violence is not always in the form of homicide and physical attacks. That's the worst of it. But every day, I think every day, if you pay attention as a queer person, there's maybe some form of microaggression that you'll experience either directly from other people or just systemically, like going on a shopping website and finding that there's only a men's section and a women's section. That's like a kind of microaggression in itself if we really pay attention. So yeah, I think one of the largest disparities is this lacking sense of safety, respect, and belonging. And of course, yeah, there's many laws that should be changed, but I think the main thing that is lacking is education, which is why I'm always down to be part of trainings and things such as this, because I think this is what matters. This is what makes the biggest difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Josh, what are your thoughts on this?
So Chris pretty much stole the words out of my mouth. But I really do believe that education is something that's really needed. I've always been the person that believed in starting from the bottom and working your way up to the top of the food chain, just so that people can start being educated at an early age, just so that they can know what exactly is happening out in the world. Again, policies may not make a difference. I think it's how we think about how we can make a difference that makes a difference, if that makes any sense to each of you. And even so, from starting from the bottom, I mean, we could avoid certain things that's out in the community, because again, it's systemic. The Board of Social Work, for example, voted that that they had to change like the code of ethics to allow discrimination based on gender identity and discrimination on sexual orientation, disability. And this happened about 2 weeks ago, but thank goodness it was actually revoked. But I'm only imagining that if education was actually instilled and continue to be instilled, that these things wouldn't happen as much as they are happening at this moment in time. And the same thing could happen for the trans-military ban and all these other things that were happening out in the community. And even the targeting of trans children. For example, with the Trump's Justice Department and their support of not having trans girls be a part of girls' sports. I mean, these things could make a difference. So I personally believe that education is key, and that is how we can make a difference in the world that we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. So Aiden, what are your thoughts on this?
I want to second everything that's been said already. I think it's also important to recognize that we have to begin education at a younger age. So I oversee a community education program on Long Island, and we fight to get into high schools. Colleges have no problem. They bring us in, no issue. We fight to get into high schools. We fight really hard to get into to middle schools, and elementary schools just are almost all are saying no. We've only got 3 elementary schools across all of Long Island that will allow this type of education in their school system. Now, of course, education looks different for every age bracket, but it's really important that we start these conversations from a younger age, so that people are growing up in a world where they know that these identities exist, that they are more affirming to these identities. And we also need to remember that young people grow up to be politicians. And if we aren't starting these conversations younger, then we aren't affecting the people who are in the future going to make the decisions that affect our lives. I also think, and I'm so glad that I believe both of you brought up like the responsibilities in our professions. And I really believe that we have to be holding our professions accountable. For those of us that are social workers, mental health counselors, we should not be allowing people to graduate who are not prepared to serve these communities. I did watch what was going on in Texas with that board ruling in the last couple of weeks. And it hurt my soul as a social worker to know that there were people out in the world who believe that needed to be put into action. It hurts my soul as a social worker to know that there are people out there who are providing conversion therapy under the social work lens. We need to be fighting against our professions and really holding them accountable so that these things are removed. And to go back into the conversation about how important intersectionality is and to focus on that, I think that we have to, as a community, this is both as a society and as LGBTQ people, be actively fighting racism, have an anti-racism perspective, and be really focusing on recognizing the fact that racism in America is an epidemic, is affecting the mental and physical health of our clients, of our communities, and we have an obligation, an ethical obligation to be fighting against it. And I think that we cannot just fight for LGBTQ equality. We cannot just fight for against racism. We need to be fighting for both of those together, not just because they are connected and there are people who experience both, because they're often rooted in a lot of the same issues and the same beliefs. And in our society, the only way that we're going to challenge those things is if we start education from a younger age. So it really does go full circle.
That was incredibly well said. 1000%. Isms are isms. They just take different forms. And dividing and conquering may not be the best approach. So thank you. And Julie, what can you add to this?
I'm going to take us to a different direction. Although I love the comments that have been made, our focus has been on making legislative changes. Mm-hmm. Obviously, for New York State, our community was truly impacted in January of last year when the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act finally passed, giving our community statewide civil rights, which was so important. It was really the starting point. From there, we started working on the gay and trans panic defense and get that removed out of our courts. For those who may not be aware, it was a defense used in courtrooms, basically that said, I went to a bar, I met this girl, I brought her back to my place, and then I found out she was trans and I lost my mind and I killed her. And they would actually lower sentences because of your momentary insanity because of the fact that you found out someone was trans. That is no longer allowed in New York State, thank God. We stopped that at the end of last year's session. In this year's session, of course, it's been impacted by COVID, but we worked on gender neutral bathrooms in public spaces. So now instead of having, you walk into a McDonald's and there's a men's room on the right and a women's room on the left, now they will have, as long as they're single stall bathrooms, gender neutral signage on the outside so that anyone can use those bathrooms and we don't have to be specifically male or female. We just can use the bathroom, which is really important for our non-binary community members. There is a very important piece of legislation which we're working on right now, which is called the Walking While Trans Bill. This is a bill that would ban a penal code in New York State that allows police officers to stop women specifically, and more specifically, women of color, both trans and cis, from loitering for the possibility of prostitution. And police can make that decision. So if they think that the skirt is too high or that the top is too low or that the person is hanging around the corner too long or any of those things, they can profile and once they stop, they can frisk. So basically it's like a stop and frisk 2.0. So we're in the midst of trying to get that passed. And since the legislative session has not yet officially ended, it was supposed to end in June, but because of COVID, it's still been running on. We're hoping that after the election, steps will be taken to pass this important piece of legislation. Finally, we're working with a number of groups on wording for what's called the Gender Identity Prison Protection Bill, which would take care of those who have been incarcerated and who may have a gender identity which differs from their biological sex. Here in New York, in Long Island, specifically in Nassau County, our organization is working with the sheriff for the Nassau County Jail, and we are working with the Commissioner of Police to get their transgender policy off the ground. And I've been doing a number of trainings at the Nassau County Police Academy, just getting people aware of the fact that we exist, and some of the, if we call it best practices that they might use in dealing with our community. So we've taken a harder tack, and for me at least, I think it's easier if we focus on specific goals and work towards them and leave all the other noise and all the other stuff that's going on away, because I think we're more effective by focusing on a problem and attacking it and seeing if we can't win somehow, some way, rather than worry about all the other stuff that's going on outside and around us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's amazing work you've been doing. I'm very happy to learn about several of those victories. I think since even the last time you and I spoke. So that's extremely exciting to hear. Thank you. So we have a wonderful question from one of our audience members that I'm going to go ahead and jump to because I think their questions are always going to be better than anything I come up with. The question is, how do you explain to cis people who say the Supreme Court won't do anything to LGBTQ rights, that it is the threat that something will happen that is of concern? And I will open that up to whoever would like to jump in.
I have to admit, I didn't understand the question. Could you do that again? Because it was a little.
Yeah, my understanding of the question is basically when you have somebody who is not LGBTQ and they say, you know, oh, don't worry about it, the Supreme Court won't do anything to LGBTQ rights. How do you explain that it's the threat that something will happen that's of concern rather than whether or not the Supreme Court will make any rulings?
Well, I think that first of all, the way the Supreme Court is now going to be set up, we definitely have some issues that we have to be afraid of. So I don't think it's now something that's under the covers. I think it's right out in the open, and I think community members should be concerned about the fact that there are major issues and things that can be taken away from us. Just in the case of the Affordable Care Act, I mean, forget about more specific things to our community. How about healthcare for everyone? That's something that's really a possibility to get destroyed. So, you know, talking about the threat, I mean, I think the threat is real. But more importantly, when these changes are made, or even the discussion of it, what happens is that the general public is not totally informed of what's actually going on. So as a result, they get, oh, so it's okay now that I can discriminate, right? No, but they don't know that. Some of the bigger issues, and even in New York State now, where we have civil rights that have been around now for a good year and a half, if not a little more, there are still people that are going, I didn't know that was there. I didn't know what I was doing was harassment. I didn't know what I was doing was discriminatory. So there's a message that may not also be a part of the actual hard, legislative or courtroom cases that people, and that's one of the reasons why I think we're dealing with such hatred and harassment and violence against our community, is that the president of the United States has now allowed it to be, free reign. You can just go out and do whatever you have to do because they're the other, and the other is dangerous, and we don't like the other. And that's really where it's at. So, we've got a long way to go from where we're at right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add for that question?
Alicia, if I can add, I want to second everything that Julie said, but I want to add as far as how to actually have the conversation, because I have these conversations a lot. I actually facilitate our Pride for Parents program at the agency, so I'm meeting often with people who are cisgender, heterosexual, who are learning slowly about this community, but really don't know a whole lot. And often the conversation just needs to be put on a personal level of, if you are a cisgender straight person, this is never a conversation that is happening when it comes to our government about your rights. I think sometimes just putting it on that level and explaining that for the cisgender people in the world, nobody is ever debating whether you can get married. Nobody's ever debating whether you can use a restroom. No one is ever debating. Well, I'm going to take back. They absolutely debate what you can and cannot do with your body. But I think sometimes we have to get on a really personal level and not always make it about like the big terms and the big, secret behind politics when we're actually having the conversation. I think we need to have those conversations as providers and as people who are doing the work, but on a one-on-one level with someone maybe in your family or someone who you're just having a conversation with a friend who doesn't quite get this, that's typically my approach, is to really point out how these things affect me as a trans person in the way that they don't affect my cis friends, or affect my queer friends in a way that don't affect my straight friends, and really try to point that out in a way that helps them understand how it's affecting an individual's life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
One very quick thing that I will add to this. And I will disclose that my father is a very avid Trump supporter. Yikes. So I'm just thinking about the conversations that I've had with him and my many failed attempts at getting through to him. And I still don't think I have, but the closest that I have come, I think, is when I had to make it like very personal to him for him to start to understand. So I had to say, imagine we had an administration that said everybody else should have these rights except for Italian white men over the age of 60. Would you, like, how would you feel? How would you feel walking through the world? I had to make it like really personal. He maybe shifted 5% through that conversation. Not a whole lot, but something. So yeah, I think, first of all, I mean, logic, our rights have been rescinded and reversed and thrown around before, okay. But I think making it personal, again, going back to this like emotional aspect, is sometimes our best hope at getting through to people, because I think there is like a disconnect. It's just hard for people to just hear facts and figures and voices of people that they don't really identify with and to really care.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I know, that's something I can actually address for me personally. When I was writing my dissertation on the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, one of the things that people I was interviewing kept saying was how painful it was to have their most personal, intimate lives debated by people that had absolutely no stakes in the game. I think it's not even about whether or not the Supreme Court will or will not do anything about, rescinding rulings protecting LGBTQ people, but that it's up for debate at all. I think that was the real gist that I've experienced around topics like this. So another really good question from one of our participants was, because many of you directly serve LGBTQ individuals, what specific impacts, if any, have you observed with COVID-19 having on them that maybe haven't impacted cishet people in the same way? I know, Josh, you already spoke about this a little bit with the visitations and hospice and that kind of thing. I don't know if there was anything else that you or any of the other panelists would add.
It's pretty much the whole visitation issue, and the fact that working within a hospital setting, we don't realize it, but those who are in a heterosexual relationship have privileges in terms of they're able to visit. But if you're in a gay relationship or what have you, it's actually a little bit difficult, especially if you're not married. And I always go back to this case I had with two gay men and how both of them were not married, but they were together for at least 45 to 50 years. And the family of the patient didn't want his boyfriend to come visit whatsoever. And they've always had this sort of toxic relationship. And that has always been pretty difficult in seeing, but we always try to at least like sneak them up because we do believe that they do deserve to see their loved one, especially when they're on their deathbed and they can't really talk whatsoever. They do deserve that right, and they reserve that right. Another thing I do see working in the setting that I work in is religion. So we do have a lot of Catholic priests and fathers that work with us closely, but they tend to assume that every person is of one religion, but it's not true. And I remember that there was another gay couple who got very angry about that because they're completely different. They're actually Wiccan, and you're singing all these different things, and you're providing sacraments and blessings and things. And I think that's what makes it pretty different, is that we have to alternate the way that we think that people are, because that's not who they are. And we have to be more tailored to what the patient or the family wants. And sometimes we can't be too tailored because then the patient's family or loved ones may not be able to see the patient at all. So it can be a very sticky situation. And we just have to be very mindful of it.
Definitely. Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts or a response to that question? Yeah, Chris.
One of my trans clients, and what we see is so typical of queer people, is the avoidance of the healthcare system unless and until like absolutely necessary. So one of my clients was affected by COVID personally, diagnosed with it. It took like getting pretty seriously ill before they actually wound up having to call 911 to go to the hospital. And at the hospital, they were called out for going into the women's restroom. So they're like seriously ill and then have this trauma compounded on top of that. You know, so yeah, so things like that, just taking even longer to go get tested or, you know, or treated, no matter what's going on for them during these times, COVID or some other kind of illness. So that, and also, what else would I say? I guess I will leave it on that for now because my other thought escaped me.
If it comes back, let me know.
Alicia, I just wanted to throw out two other thoughts if I could in regard to this. I think everyone is feeling isolated, but for our community members, it's even worse. And the other point that I'd like to make is that there is a danger in sharing the bubble with your family or with you know, roommates or whatever, because they may not be as understanding in regard to your need for gender expression or whatever, which creates possible violence and harassment within your bubble. So it's an additional issue that our community faces during this period of time with social distancing and everything else. So this feeling of isolation is seriously increased, and the isolation is also dangerous to our health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
To add a little bit to that, I'm so glad that Julie brought that up. I was thinking a lot about our clients who are right now receiving virtual services. We have the benefit that in New York State, you can access mental health support without parental consent. So a lot of our clients are coming in as parents who have no idea they're accessing our services, whereas now they're sitting at home on a Zoom call and their mom is one very thin wall away. So their access to care is also really being affected and what they can share in their sessions. On top of that, another housing concern we've seen a lot of our clients, because being at home with their nuclear family was a really unsafe environment, they were sleeping on couches or kind of surfing from one house to another. And during COVID, a lot of their friends said, you know what, social distancing, I just don't feel safe anymore. Having someone just stay on my couch and come and go as they please. So a lot of my clients were just kicked out of what was a safe, for them, a more affirming, safe living environment. And now are living on the street or living in their car because they didn't have access to a safe place to live in during COVID. The other thing that I am starting to observe more recently is as companies start to furlough more frequently or even fire due to the financial difficulties of COVID. And this is a little bit more hearsay, but just something that I'm observing my clients are reporting is that they often feel as though they are purposefully the one that gets furloughed or the one that gets fired because they were queer. And it was easier to get rid of them during COVID when a company already wanted to get rid of them. And that's something that I'm only starting to observe over the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to pay a lot more attention to it.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. So we have several more wonderful questions from our audience, but we have 2 minutes left. So I want to just acknowledge that all the questions that were asked were great. And if we had another hour to go through those, I would love to discuss them all. But I also want to be respectful of everyone's time, of our panelists who have been so generous in being here today and sharing their expertise and their thoughts and their input on this. I want to thank again Becca and Callie for their assistance, and Andrew Nerlish. And thank you to all of you that came out for this event. It's been an amazing conversation. If anybody has anything remaining to say, let's go ahead and let our panelists say anything that they would like to wrap up in the remaining minutes. Otherwise, I just want to thank everyone again and wish you a great rest of your day of dialogue.
Okay, if no one else is going to say anything, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be here. And I don't know if this was voluntary attendance for everybody who's here or not, but I really commend you either way for being here, because that definitely is the first step to cultural competency, is just having that openness toward learning. For me, it's everything. So I hope you've had an open mind and open heart throughout this, and I appreciate you too.
Mhm.
Thank you again. We appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
And I would like to express my gratitude for all of you coming today. So I'm very happy that I got to be part of this. One thing I do want to reiterate is vote. If you haven't voted, it is imperative that you do. Someone you know and love could be suffering in silence without you knowing it. And you have a chance to make a difference in not only their lives, but also within your own. From a political and personal stance, you have to ask yourself, if the shoe was on my foot, what kind of world would I like to live in so that I could be at peace? And I just want you all to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much, Kelly.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming today. If you are here attending the session, you are free to go. This is the end of the session. As you've seen in the chat, we have several more sessions today you're welcome to come to. So we look forward to seeing you at those as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.